have a good number here. This is being recorded. So if you joined late, you can just pick up this first part, the introductory part. My name is John Nicholson. I work at ALTECH as a senior environmental engineer and jack of all trades. With us today is Paul Manning and Elham. I'm going to do the introductions. So Paul works at Manning Environmental Law. It's a leading Canadian environmental law firm based in downtown Toronto. His website is manningenvironmentallaw.com, I believe.
That's correct.
That's correct. Yeah. So if you need to find more information to him, he is and I want to make sure I get this right, Paul. Is it certified environmental law specialist?
Yes, certified by the Law Society.
Yeah, by the Law Society of Upper Canada.
Yes, now the Law Society of Ontario.
Okay, Law Society. I like the old one, but that's fine.
Fair enough.
So he's wealth experience. I've worked with Paul for many years. I've known him for a long time. So that's why we have him here, because of his expertise. And also with us is Elham Garuhi. And Elham, did I pronounce your last name right? She must be en route.
That is correct.
That's cool. All right, close enough. Okay. Elham is a professional engineer in the province of Ontario. She also has a master's degree in chemical engineering and has over 15 years of professional experience, process engineering, complex project management in the fields of environmental compliance, air dispersion modeling, environmental systems design, construction, wastewater treatment, air pollution control systems. So I think, not to brag, but I think we have two very qualified people who have more than enough capabilities to speak. So I'm going to hand over the meeting, some housekeeping matters. If you have a question, hold it till the end so we can make sure we get through the presentations. Alternatively, you can use the chat function. So if you put your mouse button down to the bottom, there's a chat feature. You can add it to the chat. You can ask a question of everyone or just to the particular speakers. And at the end of the two presentations, Paul's going to be anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. And Elham's going to be up to 20 minutes. So we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. But we're going to save those to the end to make sure we get through the presentation. So you can either jot it down and type it in, and we'll do it that way, so in an orderly fashion. So Paul, take it away with your presentation.
So hopefully that is going to be okay. So I'm hoping that you all can see. Have I shared my presentation adequately?
I can see it perfectly, Paul.
Okay, mastery of the technology. That's webinar 101, and it repays our excellent dry run yesterday. So as you heard, I'm Paul Manning. My firm is Manning Environmental Law. We're based in downtown Toronto, and we do principally environmental law, and as subsidiaries of that, we do a lot to do with energy law, some urban planning law, and also indigenous law, all of which, to my mind, falls under the umbrella of environmental law. You heard that I'm a specialist in environmental law certified by the Law Society, and you've got my website there. And for all the expertise that has been accredited to me by John's kind words, mine is going to be more of a legal overview, and you'll find that Elham's excellent presentation, which is to come, goes into more detail on some of these issues. So I'm trying to give the legal framework, and then you'll hear more detail from Elham as we go along. So first of all, and a lot of this may be known to people, but it helps to build up the framework. For air emissions in Ontario, there are two primary pieces of legislation. One is the Environmental Protection Act, and the other is the regulation made under that Act 41905, which I'm going to call the regulation for most of the time. And under one of the main things you have to do under the Environmental Protection Act is if you're running a facility that has equipment that is likely to emit contaminants to the natural environment, you're going to either have to get what used to be called a certificate of approval air, or indeed a certificate of approval air and noise, if noise and vibration is an issue for you, and now is known as an environmental compliance approval. Whereas you always used to have to obtain environmental compliance approval, now there are a series of activities that are so well known in their environmental effect that you only have to register those on the Environmental Activity and Sector Registry. And that's known for short, as I'm sure most everyone on this webinar will know, it's known as an ESA. And apart from mentioning those two items, I'm going to leave it to Elham's presentation to drill down into some of the detail on those two approvals and what you need for that, when you have to apply, when you need to register. So I'm going to move on to the regulation. So you have to comply. In addition to the Environmental Protection Act, you have to comply with the requirements of Ontario Regulation 41905, and I'm referring to that as the regulation. There are, I should add, a whole host of other obligations that you need to comply with under the Environmental Protection Act. Certainly you need to report excessive discharges to the environment, and I'm going to touch on that on my last slide when I get to that. So the regulation. The regulation limits concentrations of contaminants caused by air emissions from a facility. And those concentrations, how are they calculated? Well, they're calculated at points of impingement, and a number of points of impingement are selected, and the concentrations must be less than the relevant standard, which is in the regulation, at any POI, point of impingement. And there are three ways in which a facility can comply, depending on the emissions or depending on what kind of industry you are. So the first primary one is that you have to meet the standards prescribed in the regulation. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, because we're going to get to the news, what has changed, quite shortly, and that is going to talk about air standards and the way in which one demonstrates compliance. If you going to have difficulty complying with the standard, then you can request and hopefully receive a site-specific standard when you have to jump through a series of hoops to be able to demonstrate that it's appropriate for you to have a site-specific standard rather than complying with the general standards. And if you get that, then you just have to comply with that site-specific standard. In addition, if you are one of a certain series of designated industries, and foundries is one, there are others which are specified in the regulation, or if you have a certain specific type of equipment generally related to those kind of industries, then you can register and meet a technical standard. And there's a number of standards which are have been designated by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, MECP. And if you're in such an industry, then you would be able to register for and comply with those standards instead of the general air standards that I was referring to earlier. So you've worked out that you're a facility that has discharge of contaminants to the air. You've obtained, hopefully, your environmental compliance approval and or registered your ESA, depending on what operation or piece of equipment we're talking about. You've chosen, if that's the right word, your compliance approach. You worked out which is appropriate for your facility. And then how do you demonstrate that you're complying with your standard? Well, in my last bullet on this page, you'll see that the facility must develop an emissions summary and dispersion modeling report, EDSM, forgive me, it's ESDM, there's a typo there, to demonstrate compliance. So what's that all about? ESDM reports. Well, an ESDM report summarizes all the emissions from the facility. Just going to adjust my pictures there. And uses air dispersion models, which can be used on their own or combined with air monitoring data, actual monitoring, to assess compliance. So when you need to use an EDSM report, and I think I've got this typo perpetually through my presentation, ESDM report. So you must prepare such a report if you're applying for an environmental compliance approval, which we've discussed, if you're applying for a site-specific standard, which exceeds an upper risk threshold, and those are thresholds which are defined in the regulation. If the ministry make a request to you to prepare such a report, then you're going to have to do that. And if you're in a sector, can I just, so I think I've pulled this on. Sorry, my technological mastery has fallen by the wayside here. So in the last situation, if you're in a sector listed in Schedule 4 or 5 of the regulation, then you also have to prepare a report. The reports must be updated annually. That's not crystal clear from a reading of the regulation, but that's actually how the ministry interpret it, and more importantly, how they enforce it. The report must be accurate as at the December the 31st in the year the report was prepared. And if it needs to be updated, then it must be, that update must be completed no later than March the 31st in the following year. So we've got gone through fairly quickly those slides, because that's a build up to what is the purpose of this webinar. And the purpose, apart from giving a context and an environmental regulatory overview to how air emissions are regulated, we have a little bit of news that back in February the 1st of this year, there was a change to say that all facilities now have to comply with the standards in Schedule 3 of the regulation, and that has the end game, that is the end game of what has been a 10-year staged, phased introduction of these standards. So this year is the first year when all facilities have to comply with Schedule 3 concentrations. Also, the air dispersion models which you can use have changed. The old Regulation 346 air dispersion models have been phased out, and you can now choose from Screen 3 or Air Mod to assess compliance with the air standards in the schedule. And you must also use the ASHRAE method to assess same structure contamination. So any facilities, if you have a facility where you had to submit an application for an environmental compliance approval on or after February the 1st, 2019, then you were already asked to demonstrate compliance using the new standards and using the advanced models. And so new ESDM annual reports and annual updates for 2020 and thereafter must comply with the Schedule 3 standards and use the new air dispersion models. So what if you exceed the new standards? The problem with this is you may have been going along very comfortably complying with old standards and using old air dispersion models. And then you get to this year and you're having to introduce, or rather use, new air dispersion models to prepare your ESDM reports, and also you have to comply with new Schedule 3 standards. And if you find that you're not in compliance, or otherwise your air emissions are causing an adverse effect is an expression that is defined at some length in the Environmental Protection Act. If you're doing either of those things, then you have to go through a number of steps. Firstly, you have to notify the ministry immediately. That's under Section 28 of the regulation. And then you have to submit 30 days after that a written abatement plan recommending steps to prevent and minimize discharges. And if we mentioned the upper risk threshold in one of the previous slides, if that is likely to be exceeded, then you immediately have to notify the ministry and submit an ESDM report for that contaminant within 3 months' time. So those are very strict obligations, and you have to do those promptly. If you fail to do it, then you may be prosecuted for an offence. And so it's important to get those things dealt with very swiftly. And indeed, therefore, you need most likely an environmental consultant, such as ALTECH, to assist you with doing all that, to ensure your compliance, to make sure that you've got all your reports up to date, that you're complying with the Schedule 3 standards, using the correct air modeling approaches, and making sure that if you do have any discrepancy, that if there is an exceedance, then you're complying with the notification and abatement rules immediately. And notification is quite a theme in the environmental legislation, and I've noted in my last bullet here that there's a prohibition on discharges of contaminants above regulated levels in Section 6 of the Environmental Protection Act. So when I talk about regulated levels, that's a level specified by a regulation, and the level specified by the regulation here is the Schedule 3 standards. So there's, in addition to the requirements to notify MECP of a situation where you may exceed Schedule 3 standards. If you do exceed Schedule 3 standards, you're going to have to notify the ministry under Section 13. So you may find yourself in contravention of 3 different bits of legislation. Firstly, if you fail to notify, firstly, if you're not complying with Schedule 3 standards under the regulation. Secondly, if you fail to notify and abate in the way that I've just described under the regulation, and also for having discharged a contaminant into the air which is above the Schedule 3 standards and failed to notify it, you may find yourself at the wrong end of all sorts of potential offences and having to deal with the enforcement branch of the ministry. So it's extremely important to make sure that your air assessment is up to date. If you have the in-house competence to be able to do all these things, then that's terrific. But most industrial and similar clients will need a consultant such as ALTECH to assist them in negotiating what is otherwise quite a minefield of compliance. So that's, you already heard my biography. Doesn't say that I got a swimming certificate for 25 yards when I was at school, but apart from that, and that is my contact information where you can get hold of me if there's anything of a professional nature that I can assist with. And with that, I've tried to keep up a fair pace to make sure there's time not only for Elham's presentation, which you're going to find more useful than mine, I dare say, but also to allow a little time for questions if we have it at the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Paul. If you joined late, there's some housekeeping matters. We are recording this. So if you're a participant and you joined late, you'll be able to access the recordings and also the presentations. Those who request a copy of it, hard copies or email copies, will get those out. And then again, with respect to questions, either save them till the end or add them to chat. You can send them directly to me or to Paul and to or Elham. I already have some people sent them to me, so but we're going to save them. So there's some really good questions here, legal questions that you'll want to stay to the end. It's about getting charged and convicted, which is always people's worry. Okay, so let's keep moving. Elham is next. And while she's loading up her presentation, I'm proud to say that we spent some time practicing to make this as seamless as possible. So Elham, if you can load up your presentation, and you'll definitely want to watch this because it's multimedia and has some video to it.
Oh, I think you need to unmute yourself, Elham.
Elham, you're on mute.
So can you see the presentation?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
it looks great.
Great, thank you, John, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Paul. We're glad to have Paul online, and he addressed all the legal requirements and the changes in terms of the legal standpoints. We will talk about the changes in terms of the affection of these changes to the facilities and understanding the requirements of the air permitting. Sorry, can you see the presentation now?
I can see it fine, Elham.
Okay.
It's a person on a
it's
dock.
good.
Is it showing the second page? I'm not sure if
It did show and then it bounced back. So right now it's the intro, and then I saw the second page, which was a person sitting on a dock in a bubble. Was that the second page?
I'm not sure
It looked like a really scenic picture.
Okay, let me. Can you see it now? I think something. I will stop sharing and start sharing again. It's in the mist here.
That's not my dog, for the record.
That's
your
my
dog,
dog,
Paul.
That's my dog. I'm embarrassed.
No worry. No worries. Yeah, we're all socially distanced if anyone's worried. Very socially distanced. You're in Toronto, I'm in Mississauga, and Elham is in at the office near the DVP.
Well, the dog is in the other room, if that's reassuring.
What kind of dog is it?
It's a wire fox terrier.
Sounds like a fast dog.
It refers to the hair. He's not wired.
Oh, okay.
In any sense.
Okay. All right. I have a what kind of dog do I have? Shih Tzu mix.
Very nice.
So he'll probably be barking, although the mailman already came. So he oh, let's do the questions. I said till the end, but we might as well do some questions because they were legal.
Good plan.
And maybe Paul. So we're waiting for Elham on her technical problems. Okay, so one question was with respect to the three options. You know, you meet the reg.
Yes.
With respect to the site-specific standard. So you asked the ministry, hey, can we have a site-specific standard for our environmental compliance approval? A couple questions under that was, do you have any idea how many of those have been issued in Ontario? Are they a rarity or somewhat common? And then secondly, are they based on a toxicology assessment similar to, contaminated sites, how you can get a site-specific one, or best available technology similar to the states, or a combination of those? Do you know that, those two?
It's so some of those are sort of like practical questions that that Elham might be better placed. I don't know the exact figures. I don't have the statistics. My understanding is that it's not it by no means rare, but you have to be able to demonstrate it. I don't think it's toxicology as such. I think you just have to demonstrate that there are good practical reasons why you're unable to comply, and why compliance with the standard you've selected nonetheless would not have an adverse impact. That's how I understand it. I'm seeing that Elham is back online.
Yes, sorry for the problem.
Okay, you ready?
So I'm just saying, Elham, we dealt with a question, and it was a question: how frequently are there site-specific standards? And I didn't have the statistics, but it's not infrequent to get a site-specific standard. And as I understand, you have to demonstrate to the ministry why it's for good, sound, practical reasons it's not possible to comply, but why non-compliance, or rather why compliance with your selected standard, would nonetheless not have an adverse environmental effect. So how does that go in practice when you have to deal with a site-specific standard?
It is a very complicated process. The ministry consultation is required, and all steps that need to be demonstrated to the ministry why this specific site cannot meet those limits. And so the ministry involvement is the key point here.
And as I understand it, you have to demonstrate to the ministry's satisfaction that the standard you selected in place of the general standard nonetheless would not have an adverse environmental effect of any significance.
Yes.
Is okay.
So
should we? Sorry, forgive me. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I will continue. Sorry for the problem. So before starting, I want to talk about ALTECH. So my name is Elham Guruhi, and I'm from ALTECH Environmental Consulting Ltd. ALTECH is part of its parent company, Char Technologies. Char is an environmental consulting and technology firm, and we offer different services in permitting and compliance, and property due diligence, resource efficiency, and advanced industrial clean technologies for air, water, and waste, and renewable energy. So if you want to reach to us about any of these areas, you can directly reach to John or me after this webinar if you have any questions. The objectives of this webinar are to learn about the air and noise permit types and the permitting process in Ontario. And you will be introduced to the air contaminants concentration standards that applies to all Ontario facilities as of February 1st, 2020. And to understand what steps need to be taken to ensure compliance with the new requirements under Ontario Regulation 419/05. And we will provide you with an example of industrial facilities compliance before and after February 1st, 2020. We want to run a poll to know more about you and the sector you represent. Please choose a sector that best describes your facility or processes. I'll give you time to answer. We are still receiving answers. It looks like that most of the participants are from general manufacturing sector. Paul already explained changes before and after February 1st, and this slide will summarize some of them here. Before February 1st, Schedule 2 standards applied to some facilities and Schedule 3 standards applies to some other facilities. After February 1st, most facilities, all facilities are required to be in compliance with the Schedule 3 standards, which is more stringent. Before February 1st, the emission limits were based on half an hour and 1 hour averaging periods. Now, all facilities must have the 24-hour or 1 hour averaging periods for their emission limits. The emissions were higher, the limits were higher before February 1st. Now it is lower. For example, the nitrogen oxide had a half an hour limit of 500 microgram per cubic meter. Now it has 400 for 24 hour and 400 for 1 hour and 200 for 24 hour. Before February 1st, a very simple Ontario Regulation 346 air dispersion model was applied to facilities. Now all facilities are required to use more stringent air dispersion model, which could be AirMod or Screen Tree or ASHRAE model. With all these changes, facilities that were in compliance using older air dispersion model and Schedule 2 standards or limits might now be out of compliance. What does this mean for facilities? So if a facility was in compliance with Section 19, depending on the permit type, running a screening model to show the compliance, or ESDM report update, or applying for a new air permit amendment is required. We will talk about the air permit update because it is a complete process that includes all the steps. Note that not all facilities are required to apply for a new permit type. So the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks has two approval types, ECAs or Environmental Compliance Approvals and ESERs or Environmental Activity and Sector Registry. ECAs are designed for businesses that may cause more potential adverse effect to the environment. Businesses with less complex operations may register themselves online on the ESER. Ministry has different ESER types. Most of them do not require assessing of the air emissions, and as long as the facility falls under the requirement for that ESER, they are eligible to register. Ministry also introduced a new ESER in 2017 called Air Emissions ESER. This ESER is designed for industrial facilities with multiple processes that can discharge contaminants to the atmosphere, but the processes are less complex or may pose less potential adverse effect to the environment. This new ESER process is faster because the registration is online and the ministry review is not required. To register, a licensed engineering practitioner or LEP is required to sign and stamp the reports and states its accuracy. It will also help ministry to maintain their 1-year service time for ECA applications. So how do we identify which permit type does apply to a facility? The first step is to determine the facility's NAICS code. A NAICS code is a classification within the North American Industry Classification System based on the operation types. Then we will compare the NAICS code to the Ontario Regulation 117 or ESER regulation. If the NAICS code found in the ESER schedule, then the facility is not eligible for the ESER. If not, we will review the facility for processes that are ESER excluded. Examples of these processes are electroplating or gas turbines or outdoor metal processing or some odorous activities. And there are some other processes that are not listed here. If none of those processes are included in the facility, then the facility is eligible for the ESER. Otherwise, an ECA application is required. Once we determine the air permit type for the facility, we will take the below steps to apply for the permits. The first step is to review all the processes and operations that are producing air emissions. I included some examples of the processes here that are producing air emissions, like combustion processes. All facilities have combustion equipment like HVACs or boilers. Paint booths, they're producing emissions, including PM emissions and VOC emissions, or some other VOC emissions from chemical consumptions like sanitation chemical consumption. Soldering emissions from soldering operations, and PM emissions from cutting, regrinding, or welding, and etc. Or some facilities have cooling towers, and the cooling tower emissions should be considered in the air emissions as well. We also need to review processes and operations that are producing noise or vibration emissions. Rooftop fans are example of the processes that are producing noise emissions, as well as HVAC equipment. Some truck activities and material handlings are very noisy and producing noise emissions. Also, emergency generators are part of the noise emitting equipment. After that, we have to determine the worst case scenario for the facility. The worst case could be a maximum production per day or maximum material consumption per day. It could be the maximum operating hours per day or any other worst case condition that applies to the facility. And why should we consider the worst case scenario? Because the production rate and manufacturing activities vary depending on the demand and customer orders, and they're not consistent day to day. So if we are able to show compliance for the worst case scenario for the facility, then the compliance for the other scenarios are also evident. Then we have to calculate the emission rates for the facility and for each process based on emission factors or engineering calculation or mass balances. Consider a facility that uses 500 kilogram per hour of raw material. By doing engineering calculation, we determine that 2.5 grams per second of this raw material is emitting to the atmosphere through the stack. After calculating the emission rates, the air dispersion modeling needs to be done for the plant. By applying to air permit, a facility tells ministry that contaminant concentration outside of the property boundary meets the limits. That's why dispersion modeling comes into play. By doing the dispersion modeling, we determine the concentration of the contaminant at the point that it hits the ground after traveling through the atmosphere. This is called point of impingement or POI concentration. If the POI concentration meets the ministerial limits, then we will prepare the ESDM report and all other requirements under ECA or EASER, and will register the facility to the ECA or EASER. If not, the POI concentration exceeds the ministerial limits, we have to refine the calculation based on the facility updated information, or some facilities may require air pollution control technologies to reduce the emissions. To refine the calculation, we can revise worst case scenario, or some facilities decide to cease using a specific problematic chemical or replace it with other chemicals. It is also very critical here that the facilities provide the information as accurate as possible to streamline the process and avoid any delays. This is an example of a plant with different emission sources: idling truck, emergency generator, and manufacturing operations. All emissions from these sources are determined using emission rate calculation, and then we perform the air dispersion modeling to determine the maximum concentration outside of the property boundary. As you can see, the pollutant concentration decreases with distance due to dilution and dispersion into the air. As such, sources that have more distance to the property boundary will potentially have less POI concentrations. The ministry's approved air dispersion model that needs to be used for most facilities to show compliance with the Schedule 3 standard is AirMod. AirMod is a Gaussian steady-state plume model, which is developed by US EPA and adopted by MECP. The mathematical model is shown in the left-hand side. This picture shows that how plume extends and disperses through the atmosphere on the wind direction. The right-hand side movie is the output of the AirMod computer software. The plume intensity is shown by contouring colors. The movie is created to show variation of plume over time in an hourly basis. The actual meteorological data and land space data is used in the dispersion model. As you can see, the plume direction and length and intensity changes over time, depending on the actual weather conditions. The highest POI concentration resulted from running 5 years weather data for the facility will be reported as the highest POI concentration for that contaminant. I just want to add that this is our office building. We just developed a model to show that how the plume changes over time. Now we want to present a case study of a facility in Ontario. This facility is a plastic manufacturing facility. It has VOC emissions from extrusion and molding activities. It has PM emissions from regrinding, vacuum pumps, and cooling towers. And it has combustion equipment, and the emissions from combustion equipment also sources of emission. The facility has an ECA permit based on Schedule 2 standards and Section 19 of the regulation. And the air dispersion model was completed using Ontario Regulation 346 model. And the facility was in compliance with all these requirements. After February 1st, the facility made no changes to their processes and operations. The worst case scenario was considered the same as previous, the one that was listed in their previous ECA application. And the emission rates converted to a 24-hour period based on their operating conditions. A Schedule 3 air standards used to determine the compliance, and the air dispersion model used to show the dispersion. The results showed that some contaminants have emissions over ministry limits, Schedule 3 ministry limits, even with no changes in their processes. So what steps have we taken to ensure compliance for this plan? First step was to revisit the worst case scenario with facility collaboration. After revisiting the worst case scenario, we understood that this scenario was considered very conservatively and that case will never happen at this facility. It was assumed that all molding machines are operating at 100% capacity at the same time. This assumption was revised based on facility consultation, and the calculations were refined based on the new operating conditions. We performed the air dispersion modeling, and the out-of-compliance components decreased from 6 to 1. They still had one component, total VOC, which was still over the negligibility limits. I just want to clarify that the total VOC doesn't have ministerial limit, but it has negligibility limits. So if such substance is over negligibility threshold, a toxicology assessment is required. In this case, it was not possible to perform a tox assessment because the total VOC is not a single substance and its component vary depending on the source. So the facility had two options: to install an air pollution control technology to reduce the total VOC amount to below the negligibility amount, or there was another option to speciate the total VOC into its components by lab analysis or research data. We chose the second option, and we were able to speciate the VOC content based on the resins that they were using, and the results showed that the speciated components are all within ministerial limits. So the facility was in compliance with these new operating conditions, and we were able to register them to the EASER because the facility was eligible for the EASER. I just want to note that this new operating condition that we revised their worst case scenario was listed in their ESDM report as their limit. So in future, if they want to increase their production or change operating condition, a new assessment needs to be done. This is a demonstration of the air modeling for another client. We show the facility anonymously to protect the client's information. So the quality of the video might be affected by the Zoom. I just want to give a heads up, but if you want to have the full video, we will able to provide. So let me.
Now we would like to present you a case study on air dispersion modeling for a manufacturing facility in Toronto, Ontario. Here we have a facility located inside an industrial park. The property boundary for this facility is the green line shown here. Let us switch over to the AirMod model itself. Before running the AirMod model, we need to set up building envelope, emission sources, and the receptor grid. We can define the exact property boundary based on local zoning maps. The multi-tiered receptor grid consists of over 1,000 green points shown here. The receptors are spaced out based on their distance from the property boundary. Emission sources are added to the model based on actual stack location, with parameters including exit flow rate, temperature, stack height, etc. We have completed the first step. Now, let's move on to another important aspect of the model, which is the regional meteorological data. These data are collected by the weather station. It has two components, surface data and upper air data. The data contains the direction and speed of wind at different elevations. Next, we need to apply the regional terrain data and assign elevation points to the model. This step will transform the model from 2D to 3D. Both meteorological and terrain data have a direct impact on the air dispersion modeling result. Lastly, the building envelope is based on the drawing provided by the facility or from site survey, with exact parameters such as building dimensions, heights inputted into the model. This information is used for building downwash analysis and air dispersion modeling. Now, we have built a highly accurate 3D model, which we can see and verify it on Google Earth in 3D. We wanted to have better inputs because it can give us accurate modeling result. After running the model, we would get modeling results with concentration contours. We can also visualize the concentration contours inside Google Earth in 3D. We can clearly see the location with a higher pollutant concentration. The AirMod model is much more detailed than the previous regulatory model because it is based on various modeling parameters that require significantly more work. It can accurately capture a facility's air emission situation for environmental compliance and many other purposes. We hope you enjoyed this short introductory video on AirMod. Thank you.
And to summarize, all plants in Ontario need to be in compliance with Section 20 and Schedule 3 standards as of February 1st, 2020. And they need to assess their compliance with the new requirements. This assessment can be done by updating the ESTM report or simply running the screening models. And if the POI emissions exceed the ministerial limits, some modification to the operating conditions or to the facility is required. And the plant may need to apply for a new air ECA or EASER permit, depending on the condition. So this concludes this presentation. Now I want to hand it over to John for Q&A. But before that, I want to thank my colleague Ethan Jiao, who helped in this webinar a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Elham, and I really like that video. So, okay, I had some questions people gave me. So hopefully, Paul, you can unmute because some of them apply to you.
I'm unmuted.
Okay, super. Okay, someone asked about enforcement actions for failing conditions in an ECA. What's your take on that? Is it? Oh, there's my dog. Is that? Sorry, I'm tired of talking to my dog. Sorry. Would it be a charge, or do you think it would be just a director's order, or a notice from a district officer? What's your opinion on?
Well, the ministry have a policy for enforcement, and it's like peeling layers of an onion. So it will depend on the seriousness of the offence. It will depend on your past track record. It will, but in short, in answer to your question, in most circumstances, I would expect them to serve an order for you to come into compliance, and less likely, and the order itself may be quite onerous to comply with, and you would have to. So perhaps I should just flag here. What do you do if you are enforced against? If you get an order and you don't agree with it, of which, let's say for the sake of argument, you don't, you have to take action very, very swiftly. You have days within which to effectively challenge and appeal an order to most likely the Environmental Review Tribunal. So anybody who's listening, if you get enforced against and you want to appeal, you can't just sit on it and wait for a week to consider it or speak with your lawyer or whatever. You have to literally deal with it on the turn. So let me say that. You could be prosecuted for any of these things because technically they are any contravention of the statute or the regulation or the conditions of your ECA is or certainly can be an offence, and they could prosecute you. For the reasons I've said, less likely to do so with an initial or a minor offence, more likely to deal with it by an order. If you don't comply with the order, then they'll move on to the next kind of enforcement, and prosecution usually comes lower down the scale, and it depends, you know, what you've done. So in a slightly different context, if you've had a spill and you fail to report a spill absolutely immediately to the Spills Action Centre, then there's a fairly good chance that they will be considering prosecution for the omission of doing that. Similarly, a discharge to the environment that may adversely affect environmental interests, you have to report that. That's not necessarily a spill. Similarly, as I said, pointing to Section 13 of the Environmental Protection Act, you have to report exceedances over regulatory amounts. So any of these things could land you in some level of trouble. I think mainly an order will do it, but occasionally, depending on your circumstance, you have to expect the possibility of a prosecution.
Okay, as a follow-up, someone asked, maybe this is hopeful thinking, a silver lining, any loosening of enforcement because of COVID? Have you seen any of that?
I haven't. Well, actually, I was going to turn to Elham for this to see if she's had anything come across her desk in terms of enforcement. I don't think there has been a deliberate holdback in enforcement, but I do think that the circumstances of how social distancing and remote working is affecting everybody has affected the ministry as well. But I don't think so. I think there's been a de facto relaxation, but I don't think you can rely on that. I don't think they've specifically given a go by for not complying with your standards. I'm not sure, Elham, if you've seen any relaxation in the approach to reporting deadlines or things like that from the ministry during COVID.
So for the ECAs, I haven't seen any relaxation. For MPRIs, ministry extended the deadline for reporting, but for the ECAs, no relaxation. But I may add that the ministry might not visit the facilities more often. But if a facility receives a complaint, they will definitely take care of it immediately.
Okay, I have
Absolutely.
a question. Oh, sorry. I have a question from someone who asks this. Maybe this is a bunch of wishful thinking questions. Does the Reg 346 model give a more conservative point of impingement number versus the new models, the AirMod, Screen, or ASHRAE, under certain circumstances?
I'm going to pass that straight to Elham, I think.
Yes. So the AirMod, I can say that the AirMod model is more accurate because it considers all the parameters of the stack and the building and the metadata and train data. For some cases, if the stack has a good buoyancy, the AirMod model results might be even better. than the OREC 346 model. But in most cases, because the OREC 346 model is very simple model, it just considers one virtual source, the results might not be very good.
Yeah, besides that, I think it's a moot point because you're required by the requirement to do air mods or screen through your ASHRAE. So you just can't rely on not doing those, crossing your fingers and hoping that the point of impingement is more stringent, right? Is that correct?
That is absolutely right. Yeah. And the ministry is required to be under Schedule 3 standards, and the model that is used for this one is AirMod.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
You don't have an option.
Yeah, you don't have an option. You got to do it anyway.
You don't have an option. No.
Okay. Here's another question. Someone asked about truck traffic. So it's their understanding truck traffic is required to be included in noise calculations or noise emissions. But is truck traffic required to be included in the air emissions?
I will answer this question. So the truck traffic definitely will need to be included in the noise reports. But if the truck idles inside the facility, like refrigerated trucks that needs to be idle, then the emissions should be considered in the air emissions as well.
Okay. All right. Another question is, okay, this is a very specific question, but I think it applied to anyone. Okay, if you're in an industrial zoned area, like that model there, and then you end up having, for example, a house of worship move in, because, and I've seen this, is sometimes in an industrial plaza, they'll let some rent into a place for something that wasn't intended use, wasn't an industrial use. Is that considered the point? Do you use that as the point impingement, or do you use a point impingement only for a residential or parkland zoned area? Do you understand the question?
Yes, I will answer this one. So you're basically talking about the sensitive receptors. So a place of worship in an industrial sector is not a sensitive receptor. But if there is a residential area, or if there is a hotel in an industrial sector, it is considered a sensitive receptor. And the residential areas or hospitals or childcare facilities, all those facilities are considered sensitive receptors.
Okay. And the other question is noise update. Is there a noise update in 2020 similar to the air, or no? Like your air noise emissions?
Noise requirements didn't change that much. The ministry updated the guidelines, but the requirements didn't change that much like the air.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
All
there's
right.
not been a...
Sorry,
yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to add in a couple of things. Elham mentioned earlier that the ministry, on whether the ministry had relaxed in its approach, that they will always investigate a complaint, and just wanted to emphasize that the ministry often treat a complaint as evidence of an adverse environmental impact. So a complaint, stick handling complaints and potential for complaints in your locality is an important thing. And just picking up on the thing we've just discussed about sensitive receptors, I mean, that's precisely why many industries will involve themselves in and vigorously oppose new development where it will introduce a sensitive receptor into their area. Firstly, because of the increased regulatory demands it may make of them, but also simply on a straightforward nuisance claim. If you have a sensitive receptor move in and they make a nuisance claim, then that's also an exposure. So that's why facilities and their owners often involve themselves in the planning process for that purpose.
Okay, and this is perfect timing because it's 1:02 according to my watch. So, and I said 1 o'clock, so I'm 2 minutes late. That we finished this formal program. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Paul and Elham. I personally thought it was very both entertaining and informative, so I hope the participants did as well. And as a reminder, it has been recorded, so if you missed part of it or you want to share this with a colleague, we can send the recording to you. I believe we have a YouTube channel. We posted on our YouTube channel. I'll double check that. We'll include it in our email we send to you, and as well as the slides themselves, we can share with anyone who would like a copy. Other than that, have a great November 18th. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.